There are faces carved into the Mount Rushmore of country music, legends whose stories feel as timeless as the American landscape itself. You know them by heart. Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, a walking contradiction of sin and salvation. Willie Nelson, the red-headed stranger, a Zen cowboy poet drifting on a cloud of his own making. Waylon Jennings, the leather-clad honky-tonk hero, his voice a rumbling engine of defiance. They are the titans, the holy trinity of a rebellion that stared down the polished, predictable Nashville machine and forged its own path. They called it Outlaw Country. And if that rebellion has a founding document, a Declaration of Independence, it is this one legendary album, Wanted, The Outlaws. Released in 1976, it was a cultural atom bomb. It became the first country album ever to be certified platinum, then double, triple, and quadruple platinum. It was more than music, it was a statement. It proved that a raw, honest, artist-driven sound could conquer the world. It made Waylon and Willie into household names, living legends whose mythos endures to this day. But look closer. Look past the two giants who dominate the cover. Look at that fourth face. Who is that man? For so many, even for die-hard country fans, his name is a half-forgotten whisper, a trivia question, a footnote in someone else's biography. But what if I told you he wasn't just on the cover? What if I told you that, in many ways, he was the architect of the entire movement? The man who built the fortress where the revolution was born, the logistical genius, the fiery benefactor, the man who stood shoulder to shoulder with Waylon and Willie, not as a sidekick, but as an equal, and in some ways, as their fiercely protective, dangerously volatile leader. This is the story of Tompall Glaser, the forgotten outlaw, the man who kicked down the door, lit the fuse, and burned the blueprints of old Nashville, only to be erased from the history he helped write. It's a story about genius, loyalty, and betrayal. A story of a man who fought the system and won right before that same system, with the help of his friends, buried him. To understand how a figure so central could simply vanish from the narrative, we have to go back to a Nashville that looked and sounded very, very different. The Nashville of the mid-20th century wasn't the sprawling, eclectic Nash Vegas we know today. It was a company town, and the company was Music Row, a small, insular fraternity of powerful record labels and producers held absolute sway. Men like Chet Atkins at RCA and Owen Bradley at Decca were the undisputed kings. They were brilliant visionaries in their own right, but their vision was a specific and rigid one. They had perfected a formula known as the Nashville Sound. It was a direct response to the rise of rock and roll, which was stealing younger audiences. The solution? Make country music sound more like pop. They took the raw, gritty country song, the tales of heartbreak from Appalachia and the barroom laments from Texas, and they put it in a tuxedo. They sanded down every rough edge, smoothed out every quirky vocal, and slathered it in lush, sophisticated arrangements. The signature elements were violins where fiddles used to be, and velvety smooth backing vocals from pristine groups like the Jordanaires or the Anita Kerr Singers. The goal was crossover appeal, to sell records to adults in the suburbs who wouldn't be caught dead listening to Hank Williams. And it worked. Artists like Patsy Cline, Jim Reeves, and Eddie Arnold became massive stars with this polished sound. But for the artist, the system was a creative straitjacket. The producer was good. He chose the song. He chose the session musicians, the legendary studio wizards known as the A-Team, and he dictated the arrangement. The recording artist was often the last piece of the puzzle, a vocalist expected to deliver a clean performance and nothing more. Touching the mixing board was unthinkable. Suggesting your own bass player was heresy. Into this meticulously controlled world came three brothers from the flat, windswept plains of Spalding, Nebraska: Tompall, Chuck, and Jim Glaser. They were a world away from the hills of Kentucky or the dust of West Texas. Theirs was a childhood of harsh winters and hard farm work, and music was their escape. They began singing together as children, gathered around a radio listening to the Opry, honing their harmonies until they were preternaturally tight. Their voices could weave together, creating a single shimmering chord that was both complex and deeply emotional. It was a unique sound, more influenced by the intricate jazz harmonies of the Four Freshmen than the rustic sounds of the Carter family. They arrived in Nashville in the late 1950s, and for a time they played the game and played it well. They got a job as Marty Robbins' backup singers, their sophisticated harmonies adding a touch of class to his records. They toured with Johnny Cash. On stage, they were the picture of professionalism: clean suits, sharp haircuts, and flawless smiles. They won award after award from the Country Music Association for Vocal Group of the Year, year after year. They also became successful songwriters for other artists. Their masterpiece, "Our Streets of Baltimore," written by Tompall and Harlan Howard, became a career-defining hit for Bobby Bare in 1966. It was a devastatingly sad, beautifully crafted story song that showcased their immense talent. On the surface, they were a Nashville success story, but beneath the polished veneer, a deep and bitter frustration was simmering, and its heat was most intense in the heart of the eldest brother, Tompall. Tompall Glaser was not a man built for taking orders. He was a paradox. Friends and colleagues would later describe him with a mixture of awe, love, and sheer terror. He was fiercely intelligent, with a mind that could dissect a song's arrangement or a recording contract with equal precision. He was intensely loyal and generous to a fault, known for giving away his last dollar or his studio time to a struggling songwriter he believed in. But he also possessed a temper that was legendary, even in a town full of hard, living, combustible personalities. Waylon Jennings, a man who certainly knew a thing or two about difficult men, stated it plainly in his autobiography: "Tompall was one of the angriest men I ever knew. He didn't have a temper, he had a rage." Tompall saw the Nashville system for what it was: a gilded cage. He hated the lack of control, the creative condescension. More than that, he hated the economics of it. He saw the labels and publishing houses owned by corporations in New York and Los Angeles getting rich, while the artists who created the actual product were treated like hired hands. He watched his friends, men he knew were geniuses, being ground down by the machine. Nowhere was this more painful to watch than with his friend Willie Nelson. Willie was writing songs that were already timeless classics: Crazy, Funny How Time Slips Away, Nightlife. But his own records were flops. The producers at RCA couldn't figure out what to do with his unorthodox, behind-the-beat phrasing and jazz-inflected guitar playing. They tried to drown him in strings and backing vocals, but it was like trying to put a saddle on a hurricane. A frustrated Willie eventually gave up and moved back to Texas in 1700, seemingly leaving his Nashville career for dead. Tompall saw all of this, and his rage coalesced into a plan. He wasn't just going to complain about the system, he was going to build a new one right in its shadow. In a move that was completely audacious and unheard of at the time, Tompall Glaser convinced his brothers to do something revolutionary. They took the money they'd earned from their hits and tours, and they went into business for themselves. First, they bought their own publishing company, giving them control over their songs. Then, in 1970, They bought a run-down 2-story brick building at 916 19th Avenue South, just a block off the main Music Row drag. They gutted it, mortgaged everything they had, and with Tompall overseeing every detail, they installed a state-of-the-art recording console and the best equipment money could buy. They christened it Glaser Sound Studios. The locals, however, soon gave it another name. They called it Hillbilly Central. It is almost impossible to overstate how radical and transformative this building was. In an era when artists were lucky to be consulted on the key of a song, Tompall Glaser owned the entire damn factory. Hillbilly Central wasn't just a studio, it was a sovereign nation. It was a clubhouse, a laboratory, a bunker for the creatively oppressed. The front door was famously never locked, and the coffee was always on. It was a bat signal for every misfit, renegade, and poet who felt choked by the Nashville sound. And they came. Oh, how they came. Willie Nelson, revitalized by the burgeoning music scene in Austin, started making trips back to Nashville for one reason: to work at Tompall's studio. Here, free from the judgment of RCA producers, he could finally record his music his way, leading to the sparse personal albums that would redefine his career. Waylon Jennings, as for locked in his own brutal, drawn-out war with his label, RCA, found a second home at Hillbilly Central. He began to openly defy his producers, starting sessions at RCA, and then when the executives left, taking the master tapes over to Tompall's to finish them with his own band, his way. It was an act of profound professional rebellion. The studio became the physical and spiritual epicenter of a new scene. It was a place where the rules didn't apply. The legendary songwriter Shel Silverstein, the brilliant, eccentric poet, cartoonist, and children's author, became a permanent fixture. He was an unlikely figure in Nashville, a Jewish intellectual from Chicago, but he found a creative soulmate in Tompall. He practically lived at the studio churning out masterpieces for other artists. It was at Hillbilly Central that Bobby Bare, guided by Silverstein, recorded the iconic concept album Bobby Bare Sings, Lullabies, Legends, and Lies, a sprawling literary work that Nashville would have never approved. The atmosphere was one of beautiful, productive chaos. Sessions would start late at night and bleed into the next afternoon, fueled by coffee, cheap beer, and a pharmacopoeia of other stimulants. Tompall was the master of ceremonies. He was often the producer, the engineer, the A&R man, the benefactor, and the bouncer, all in one night. He had an incredible ear for a song and a raw, intuitive knack for getting the best out of people. He'd push them, challenge them, and sometimes he'd scream at them. But he gave them something no one else in Nashville would: total, uncompromising freedom. John Hartford, the banjo-playing genius behind Gentle on My Mind, recorded his wildly innovative album Aeroplane there. It was a bluegrass record, but a kind of surreal psychedelic bluegrass the world had never heard. The story goes that executives from his label, Warner Brothers, came to the studio to hear his progress. Hartford, a notorious nonconformist, played them a track that consisted mainly of him making bizarre mouth noises, yips, and guttural sounds. The executives were aghast. They looked at Tompall, the producer, expecting him to apologize and rein his artist in. Tompall just leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading under his mustache, and said, "Isn't it great?" He then promptly kicked the executives out and told Hartford to keep doing exactly what he was doing. This was Tompall's ethos in a nutshell. Art first. Commerce be damned. Protect the artist at all costs. He was building an army, and Hillbilly Central was his barracks. The Glaser brothers' own music was evolving too. They released an album in 1973 called Charlie, and the cover art alone was a declaration of war. Gone were the slick suits and neat haircuts. In their place were long hair, denim, beards, and a defiant, rustic stare. They were signaling their allegiance. They were outlaws now, too. For a few glorious years, from roughly 1970 to 1975, Hillbilly Central was the undisputed creative heart of Nashville. It was in this building that a desperate Waylon Jennings, on the verge of quitting, was coaxed into recording his landmark 1973 album, Honky Tonk Heroes. The album, comprised almost entirely of songs by the then unknown hell-raising songwriter Billy Joe Shaver, is widely considered the first true, fully realized outlaw album. It was raw, stripped down, and lyrically profound, and it broke every rule of the Nashville sound. It was born out of the defiant artist-first atmosphere that Tompall had so carefully and forcefully cultivated. But a kingdom built on rebellion is often a fragile one. The bonds are forged in fire, but they can be just as easily consumed by it. And the very qualities that made Tompall Glaser a brilliant revolutionary, his fierce pride, his iron will, his explosive temper, would also plant the seeds of his own destruction. The brotherhood at the heart of the outlaw movement was intense, fueled by shared battles, artistic respect, and copious amounts of whiskey. But it was incredibly volatile. These were not easy men. They were proud, stubborn, and possessed egos the size of Texas. The relationship between Tompall and Waylon in particular was a complex cocktail of brotherly love, intense rivalry, and simmering resentment. Waylon saw Tompall as a visionary and a protector, but also as a controlling older brother figure who sometimes treated him like a junior partner. Tompall saw Waylon as a brother in arms, but also as a charismatic star whose fame was beginning to eclipse his own foundational contributions. The pressures were immense. They were fighting a war against a billion-dollar industry, and the stress frayed every nerve. Add to that the internal politics of the Glaser brothers themselves, with Jim and Chuck often caught in the middle of their older brother's grand, risky ambitions. The tension finally exploded in a now infamous incident that has passed into Nashville legend. During one heated argument in the studio, the details of which are lost to conflicting memories and the fog of time, but likely involved money or creative control, Tompall Glaser pulled a pistol on Waylon Jennings. Let that sink in. These weren't just colleagues. They were pioneers, comrades who had stood back to back against the entire Nashville establishment. And now a gun was drawn between them. Waylon, never one to back down, reportedly just stared at him with cold fury, and the moment passed without bloodshed. But the damage was irreparable. A sacred line had been crossed. The trust that had been the foundation of their alliance was shattered. While Waylon, to his credit, never spoke ill of Tompall in public and always gave him credit for his pivotal role, that incident marked a point of no return. The easy camaraderie of the early days began to curdle into something more guarded, more suspicious, more transactional. The clubhouse was starting to feel less like a home and more like a business where the partners were suing each other. Then came the moment that should have been Tompall Glaser's ultimate triumph, his coronation as the king of the rebellion. Instead, it became the gilded coffin of his career. By 1975, the executives at RCA Records, the very ones who had fought Waylon and Willie for years, finally woke up and smelled the money. In a stroke of marketing genius, an RCA executive named Al Nally had an idea. He realized the label had a back catalog of recordings from its most troublesome artists. He wanted to package existing tracks from Waylon, Willie, Waylon's wife Jessi Coulter, and Tompall Glaser into a single compilation album. Using a Wanted poster theme, he'd call it Wanted, the Outlaws. Tompall was absolutely crucial to the concept, and he knew it. Not just because he was a core member of the scene, but because he held the cards. RCA didn't have enough recent Willie Nelson material to fill out an album, but Tompall, through his independent studio and publishing company, controlled several brilliant unreleased Willie recordings from his time at Hillbilly Central. Tompall was the gatekeeper. He contributed those tracks, along with his own fantastic solo hit, the Shel Silverstein-penned Put Another Log on the Fire, Male Chauvinist Pig, Blues, a satirical anthem that perfectly captured the outlaw spirit. The album was released in January 1976, and it detonated on impact. It rocketed to #1 on the country charts and shockingly crossed over to crack the top 10 on the pop charts. It sold and sold and sold. Wanted, the Outlaws became the cornerstone of the entire movement, the document that defined it for the mainstream. All four of them were now bona fide superstars. This should have been Tompall's victory lap. He had been right all along. His vision, his studio, his fight for independence had been vindicated on a massive international scale. But this is where the story turns from triumph to profound tragedy, because when the tsunami of money started rolling in, the real fighting began. Tompall felt he was being cut out, not just financially, but historically. He saw the Outlaw brand, a brand he had built, funded, and fought for in the trenches, being corporatized by RCA. He saw Waylon and Willie being positioned as the sole leaders of the movement. He believed that as the man whose studio had birthed the sound and who had provided crucial deal-making recordings, he was entitled to a much larger share of the profits and the credit. He saw himself being demoted from founding father to featured artist. He didn't just grumble about it. He did what Tompall Glaser always did. He fought, loudly and publicly. He sued RCA. He entered into bitter legal and financial disputes with his former comrades. From his perspective, he was demanding what was rightfully his. He was standing on principle, but in doing so, he alienated everyone. The Nashville establishment, which had always viewed him as a difficult troublemaker, now saw him as toxic and litigious. The rebels he had once sheltered, now enjoying the fruits of superstardom, saw him as a bitter accountant, a spoiler squabbling over royalties, while they were busy building their legends. He was a fighter, but he was fighting a war on too many fronts. His enemies were no longer just in the corporate boardrooms. They were former friends. And then came the final devastating blow, the one from which he would never recover. While he was battling the record labels and his former friends, another, more powerful enemy took notice of the chaos, the rumors, and the large sums of cash swirling around Hillbilly Central, the Internal Revenue Service. Allegations of financial irregularities and tax evasion, whether legitimate, exaggerated, or trumped up by his enemies, led to a full-scale federal investigation. In 1981, IRS agents raided Glaser Sound Studios. They stormed the sanctuary. They seized master tapes, financial records, notebooks, everything. The clubhouse was officially closed. The fortress had been breached and dismantled, not by a rival producer with a smoother sound, but by the United States government. For Tompall, a man whose entire career was built on the idea of independence and control, it was the ultimate violation. The safe haven he had built for his fellow artists had been desecrated and tagged with a government evidence sticker. The raid was the nail in the coffin for Hillbilly Central, and in many ways, for Tompall Glaser's public career. The ensuing legal battles drained his finances, his energy, and his spirit. His own solo career, which had produced a handful of top 10 hits in the mid-70s, stalled and died. The phone stopped ringing. The music industry, with its short memory, had moved on. Waylon and Willie were playing stadiums, their outlaw personas now a beloved part of the American mythos. They were the romantic wanderers, the cosmic cowboys, their rough edges smoothed into a marketable brand. And Tompall, he was the guy who sued his friends, the guy who got raided by the IRS, the guy who ran the studio that used to be the place to be. History is rarely kind to the angry man who demands credit. It's written by the victors, and in the public relations war that followed the Outlaw Revolution, Tompall Glaser lost decisively. He became a ghost in his own town. He retreated from the spotlight, living a quiet, almost reclusive life in Nashville. He would occasionally perform with his brothers again, a nostalgic act for those who remembered the old days. He watched from the sidelines as the music industry he helped to fundamentally change continued to evolve. The very concepts he pioneered, the artist-owned studio, the insistence on creative and financial control, the formation of independent publishing companies, became the standard playbook for generations of ambitious musicians, from Garth Brooks to Taylor Swift. But his name was rarely, if ever, attached to that powerful legacy. Tompall provided the soil, the fertilizer, and the greenhouse in which the fragile seeds of outlaw country could grow strong enough to break through the concrete of Music Row. He fought the ugly, unglamorous battles. While Waylon and Willie were out on the road, on their buses, building the myth, Tompall was back in Nashville, in an office, fighting with lawyers and accountants to keep the lights on at headquarters. It was a role that was essential, but not romantic. And in the business of building legends, romance is everything. In his later years, those who knew him said the volcanic anger had finally cooled, replaced by a kind of weary resignation and a quiet pride in what he had built. He passed away in August of 2013 at the age of 79. His obituary in many major publications was short, often describing him simply as a country singer and one of the outlaws from the Wanted album. It was a description so incomplete as to be a historical crime. It was like describing the architect of a grand cathedral as just one of the people sitting in the pews. So the next time you hear a Waylon Jennings song with that raw, defiant, take no prisoners edge, or a classic Willie Nelson ballad that seems to float on its own time, and you think about the brave rebellion they led against a corrupt system, take a moment to remember the forgotten fourth man, the one who wasn't just on the cover, but who built the house the party was in. He was a difficult, proud, and complicated man. He was no saint, but his sin, if you can call it that, was that he believed the artists who create the culture should control it. He demanded respect, and he demanded his fair share, not just of the money, but of the credit. For that, he paid the ultimate price. He was pushed out of the frame, a ghost in the narrative he helped to author. But the history of outlaw country, and indeed the history of artistic independence in modern music, is incomplete and fundamentally dishonest without the angry, brilliant, visionary ghost of Tompall Glaser. He was the outlaw's outlaw, and he deserves to be remembered.